On the night of November 15th, 1875, in a basement on Jackson Street in San Francisco, a police officer named Delos Woodruff knelt down on a wet brick floor and put his lantern to a hole in the wall. The smell came first, sweet, burnt, like caramel left too long over a flame. Then the light found them. 12 men on wooden bunks stacked 3 high. Some Chinese, some white, a few of them women. Each one lay on his side, a small lamp burning at his lips, a long pipe in his hands. None of them looked up. None of them ran. The drug had already taken the part of them that would have been afraid. Woodruff had come to make arrests. He had a new ordinance in his pocket, passed by the Board of Supervisors 3 days before. It was the first law of its kind ever written on the North American continent. It did not ban whiskey. It did not ban the morphine sold in every drugstore in the city. It did not ban the laudanum that respectable women kept on their nightstands. It banned this room, this pipe, this particular way of being ruined. That is what we know. The names in the police ledger, the date, the address, the wording of the ordinance, all of it survives. The rest is reconstructed from what came after, because the law Woodruff carried that night did not end the trade. It did not save a single one of the men on those bunks. What it did was something stranger and far larger. It drew a line. On one side stood the addict who could be pitied. On the other stood the addict who could be hunted. And the line it drew was not made of chemistry. It was made of who you were. This is the story of how America fought its first drug war in the dust and lamplight of the Old West. Of the soldiers who came home from one war carrying the seed of another. Of the mothers and the merchants and the lawmen who all in their own way were users. And of how a nation that was drowning in opium decided in the end to punish only the people it had already decided to hate. It begins, like so much of this, with a needle and a war. Opium was not new to America. It was older than America. Tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol had a name by the 1600s. The English called it laudanum, and they sold it freely, and it crossed the ocean in the medicine chests of the first colonists. By the time of the frontier, it was everywhere. It was cheap. It was legal. It was sold by the bottle at the general store next to the flour and the lamp oil, and no one needed a doctor's note to buy it. A woman with cramps took laudanum. A child with a cough took laudanum. A man with a bad tooth, a bad back, a bad night took laudanum. It was the aspirin of its century, except that aspirin does not own you. For 200 years, this was simply the way of things. Opium was medicine. Medicine was opium. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, 2 inventions arrived within a few years of each other, and together they changed the nature of the drug. The first was morphine. In the early 1800s, a German apothecary had isolated the active compound inside opium, the molecule that did the real work, and named it after Morpheus, the god of dreams. Morphine was opium distilled to its essence, 10 times the power, 10 times the grip. The second invention was the hypodermic syringe, refined into practical form in the 1850s. For the first time, a physician could put morphine directly into the blood, past the slow road of the stomach, straight to the brain. The relief was instant. It was, doctors wrote at the time, miraculous. And then came the war that would test the miracle on a scale no one had imagined. The American Civil War killed more than 600,000 men. It wounded many times that number. And to the men who survived their wounds, the army gave the only mercy it had. It gave them morphine. Surgeons carried it by the pound. They administered it for amputation and for dysentery, for the screaming aftermath of a Minier ball, and for the slow rot of camp disease. They gave it in doses no modern doctor would consider, because they had nothing else, and because a man in agony does not ask about tomorrow. When the war ended, the men went home. Some of them went home still needing the thing that had carried them through. They carried the habit into the towns and the territories, into the railroad camps and the cattle trails, west with the whole restless flood of a post-war nation that could not sit still. In the decades after, doctors had a name for it. They called it the soldier's disease. The idea that the war had created a generation of addicts in uniform. Historians now argue about how literally true that was, how many of the addicted truly trace their habit to a battlefield versus a bottle bought later at a counter. The number may have been smaller than the legend, but the legend itself tells you something. A nation had looked at its own addicted and, for one brief moment, decided they were heroes, wounded, owed, worthy of sympathy. Hold that thought. Because the nation was about to meet a different kind of addict, and it would decide something very different about him. By the 1870s, the United States was importing opium in quantities that are difficult to believe. It came in through San Francisco and through the eastern ports, hundreds of thousands of pounds of it a year, and almost none of it was regulated because there was nothing to regulate it with. There was no Food and Drug Administration. There were no prescriptions in the sense we mean. There was no list of controlled substances because the very idea of a controlled substance did not yet exist. What there was, instead, was the patent medicine. This was the great American business of the age. A man would mix opium or morphine into a sweet syrup, give it a grand name and a grander promise, and sell it by the wagon load. Soothing syrups for crying babies, tonics for tired women, cures for consumption, for cholera, for the vague and bottomless complaint the era called nerves. The bottles did not list their ingredients, because no law said they had to. A mother could spoon morphine into her infant and never know the word for what she was doing. And so, the country filled quietly with the addicted. The best estimates of the time put the number near 250,000 people. The typical American opiate addict in 1880 was not a criminal in a dark basement. She was a white woman, middle class or better, rural or small town, often southern. She had started with a doctor's bottle for a female complaint or a case of nerves, and she had never been able to stop, and her neighbors mostly never knew. This was the hidden epidemic, and the country, by and large, was prepared to look away from it. The laudanum habit was a private sorrow, a thing whispered about, a weakness. It was not a crime. But out in the West, in the lamplit basements of the cattle towns and the port cities, there was another opium. And it did not look like a private sorrow at all. The men who built the railroads came from across an ocean. Tens of thousands of Chinese laborers crossed the Pacific in the middle of the century, drawn by the gold fields and then by the work no one else would do. The blasting and grading of the transcontinental line through the granite of the Sierra Nevada. Work that killed men by the hundreds. They came to a country that wanted their labor and despised their presence. And some of them brought with them a custom from home. They smoked their opium. They did not drink it in a tincture or spoon it in a syrup. They prepared it over a small lamp, rolled it and smoked it through a long pipe, in company in rooms set aside for the purpose. The opium den. Here is the thing that the lawmen of the West could not or would not see. The white woman with her laudanum and the Chinese laborer with his pipe were taking the same drug. The chemistry did not care about the bottle or the pipe. Opium was opium. The addiction was the same addiction, the same grip, the same slow theft of a life. But one was done in a parlor, and one was done in a basement. One was done by people the country had decided were its own, and one was done by people the country had decided were strangers. And when white men, and worse, white women, began to be found in those basements, lying on those bunks beside the Chinese, the country did not see a medical problem. It saw an invasion. The newspapers of San Francisco made the opium den into a monster. They wrote of innocent white girls lured below the streets, corrupted, enslaved to the pipe and to the men who held it. The stories were lurid, and they sold papers, and most of them were closer to fever dream than to fact. But they did their work. They took a drug that hundreds of thousands of respectable Americans were quietly using in their own homes. And they made it foreign. They made it Chinese. They made it the enemy. And against an enemy, a city could pass a law. In 1875, San Francisco passed that ordinance, the one in Officer Woodruff's pocket. It outlawed the operation of, and the visiting of, opium dens. It is remembered now as the first anti-drug law in American history. Read it carefully and you see the trick at the heart of it. It did not ban opium. Opium remained perfectly legal to import, to sell, to drink as laudanum, to inject as morphine. The drugstore was untouched. The patent medicine man was untouched. The white woman on her nightstand was untouched. What the law banned was a method, the pipe, the den, the specific way that the Chinese and the people who went among them consumed the very same drug that everyone else was consuming by other means. It was, in other words, not a law against a chemical. It was a law against a people written in the language of public health. Other cities followed. Other states. Through the 1870s and 1880s, the West built a patchwork of ordinances aimed at the dens, even as the laudanum bottles stayed on the shelves and the soothing syrup stayed in the nurseries. The same years gave the country the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which slammed the door on Chinese immigration altogether, the first time the United States ever barred a people by name. The drug law and the immigration law were not separate projects. They were the same fear wearing two coats. A man could be arrested for the pipe. He could not be arrested for the bottle. And the difference between the pipe and the bottle was, overwhelmingly, the color of the hand that held it. For a generation, the drug war stayed local. A den raided here. A Chinese laundry searched there. A sheriff in a cow town breaking up a basement on a slow night. Then it went national, and the man who carried it there understood exactly what he was doing. His name was Dr. Hamilton Wright. He was a physician and a diplomat. And around the turn of the century, he became the federal government's point man on opium. He has been called since the father of American narcotics laws. He was a tireless campaigner, and he was also a man entirely willing to use the country's hatreds as a tool. Wright and his allies sold federal drug control to a reluctant Congress with arguments that were, in plain terms, about race. They warned that opium was a threat from the Chinese. Later, as the campaign widened, they would warn that cocaine made black men dangerous and that other drugs threatened other groups. The pattern set in the San Francisco basement in 1875 was now national strategy: to make a drug into a foreigner, a drug into an enemy, so that a free country would agree to be policed. In 1909, Congress passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, the first federal anti-drug law which banned the import of opium prepared for smoking, the den's opium specifically, and pointedly not the morphine and the medical opium of the drugstore. The line drawn in San Francisco was now drawn across the whole country. And in 1914 came the law that ended the old world for good, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. It brought opium and cocaine under federal control, required registration and a paper trail, and effectively ended the era of the corner store laudanum bottle and the unlabeled soothing syrup. The 250,000 quiet addicts, the white women on the nightstands, the veterans, the small-town sufferers, did not vanish. Many of them, cut off from the legal supply that had sustained them for decades, were turned overnight from patients into something the law now had a word for: criminals. Stand back and look at what the first drug war actually accomplished. It did not empty the dens for long. It did not cure the addicted. It did not slow the flood of opium that kept pouring through the ports for decades. By the measure of stopping the drug, it failed, the way every drug war since has failed. But by another measure, it succeeded completely. It built the machine. It established, for the first time in American life, the idea that the government could reach into a man's body and forbid him a substance. It established that the way you do that is to find the version of the drug used by the people the public already fears, and to ban that version first and to call it protection. It established the template, frightened newspaper, foreign enemy, emergency law, that would be used again for cannabis and for cocaine and for heroin and for every panic that followed, straight down the century to our own. Every modern drug war in America is a descendant of that basement on Jackson Street. The methods were rehearsed there. The targets were chosen there. The lie at the center of it, that the danger lived in certain people rather than in a certain molecule, was told there first, and it has never stopped being told. 250,000 Americans were addicted to opiates in 1900. The overwhelming majority of them were white and respectable and would never see the inside of a jail. The people who filled the first cells of the first drug war were, overwhelmingly, the ones holding the pipe. Same drug, same ruin, different sentence. Officer Woodruff is long forgotten. So is the ordnance he carried, except as a footnote in the histories of a war that never ended. The basement on Jackson Street is gone, paved over, built upon, lost beneath a city that does not remember it was ever there. The men on the bunks left no names. The white woman with the laudanum bottle left no name either. They were not the kind of people history writes down. They were only the kind it punishes, or the kind it forgives, according to a rule that had nothing to do with the thing they shared. And the thing they shared was simple. It was the sweet, burnt smell in the lamplight. It was the small mercy that became a master. It was the oldest trap in the world, sprung the same way on the woman in the parlor and the man in the cellar, on the soldier and the stranger, on everyone equally, without regard to the color of the hand that reached for it. The drug never cared who you were. Only the law did.